They came home shot full of holes too numerous to count, with chunks of engine missing and hydraulic fluid bleeding through gaping tears in their aluminum skin. Love them or hate them, nobody's ever questioned the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt's ability to bring a pilot back safely.
It absorbed, as I said, a tremendous amount of damage and would still fly. The inline engine wouldn't absorb anything. The radial engine, you know, we had cases of people losing several cylinders and still coming back.
They would really take, like I said, really take a beating from being shot up or anything, more than any other aircraft. They were really a tough bird.
There was one case when I was waiting for takeoff and a plane came in and landed, and it had been hit in the engine, and one piston was flipping up and down in the air, and the other piston was gone, and the plane flew in and landed, and the guy pulled off the runway. He didn't taxi it in, he got out.
47 was a great airplane for that. It absorbed tremendous damage and, you know, would still fly. The group commander took it through a tree. Literally, the aircraft went through, the tree was the loser, and the wings didn't come off, but, you know, he just forgot what he was flying and what altitude he was at and went through a pretty large tree. Lots of damage, structural damage on the wings, but the aircraft came home. I don't think that I know a 51 wouldn't have done it. I don't think a 40 or I don't think a 38 would have done it. So it was that kind of an aircraft.
I had dropped my bombs, done my job. I headed home. I get back and I land, and people are running alongside the aircraft pointing at it as I taxied. And I lean out and look, and the whole side is covered with oil. And when I got out, I got a hole a foot big in the engine and 2 cylinders missing. But it ran fine.
For 2 critical years, the P-47 Thunderbolt served as the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Force's fighter force, battling on every front in every conceivable climate and terrain. The P-47 played a major role in the defeat of the Luftwaffe in the skies of Europe. Yet since the end of World War II, the P-47 has been overshadowed by the fame and glamour of the Lockheed P-38 and North American P-51 Mustang.
I think it's comparing a racehorse to a plow horse. The P-47 was I think you could describe it as the bare-knuckles brawler. It wasn't the sleek thoroughbred as the Spitfire. It wasn't the graceful, you know, pre-war design of the P-38 that was like the Buck Rogers fighter plane of World War II. I mean, the P-38 was what everybody dreamed of. The Thunderbolt, I think, what endeared itself most of all to the pilots was the fact that it had tremendous firepower. It could carry a huge load for ground support, which is exactly what it was best at, I think. And it could take incredible amounts of battle damage. I mean, you've seen pictures of airplanes that have hit trees. They've got cylinders knocked off the engines. The cowling's gone. The wings are canted back. Just the leading edge of the wings are just beat off. The gun barrels are torn from the airplane, and it flies all the way home and brings the pilot back. I think that is the greatest quality of the airplane.
By war's end, over 15,600 P-47s had been produced, more than any other American aircraft save the consolidated B-24 Liberator. Even today, the P-47 Thunderbolt inspires intense emotions amongst the pilots assigned to fly it. After sharing the air with a 47, a pilot either came back a devoted convert or appalled that Republic ever designed such a monstrous fighter.
When I took my training, I took it at Bradley Field in Connecticut, and there were P-40 pilots that were there, and they didn't fly with you, and all they did was check you out. And they weren't really too enthused with the P-47. So when I went overseas, I did not want to fly the P-47. I wanted to get out of the 38s or 51s. When I got to this base, a P-47 came over there, and he went across that base. He pulled up and did one roll, and we just were in awe, you know. My God, that thing will fly. And I went from 1 inch tall to 10 foot tall.
It was a great experience looking back on it, flying the 47. It was a very forgiving aircraft, and the work that we flew it, used it for, was great. But, you know, it's like anything. A driver of a car, airplane drivers are the same way. You fall in love with something, and you don't want to trade. You don't want to get rid of the things. And, you know, we weren't smart enough to know that, well, it's probably going to save your life many more times than the 38 might, because it's not as vulnerable as an inline engine aircraft, whether it's a 40, 51, or 38, but it still was not my first love by any means.
The models that I flew were very sluggish and climbing. In fact, I didn't consider it very good until you got to a higher altitude, you know, where your supercharged engine was a big advantage. I think a fighter pilot would probably live longer in a P-47 than any other fighter. It's more rugged by far than any other fighter. And we only had them for a short time. They gave us our P-40s, or we were flying P-40s at the time, all the time that we were transitioning into the 47s, and they just decided to take the P-47s away and let us continue with the P-40s. And I think we were all happy about that.
Love or hate the P-47, everyone agreed on one thing. It was the toughest fighter ever built. Practically everyone who flew the Thunderbolt has a story to tell about its legendary durability. They speak of holes hacked out of the wing by light flak that were so big ground crewmen posed with their heads poking through them. Others remember cannon shells severing controls, tearing great gouges out of the cowling. They remember feeling the thumping of bullets as they slammed into the armor plating behind their seat. And they remember thanking God and Republic for building the P-47 like a brick outhouse, tough enough to handle the dirtiest of dirty work, and built to survive a Kansas tornado. The P-47 owes its genesis to a Russian emigre-turned-aircraft designer named Alexander de Seversky. He had come to the United States between the wars and had started his own aircraft company in the 1930s.
He was a Russian immigrant who flew during World War I and was a great proponent of pursuit aviation. The P-35 was his original fighter. Low wing, all metal, retractable landing gear. The second aircraft was the P-43 Lancer, which was a further refinement of the P-35 design. The ultimate was the P-47, which was the final derivative.
Just before World War II, Seversky Aviation became Republic Aviation, and the same design team that worked on the P-35 went with Republic and began working on their first major project, which was the P-43 Lancer. And you can see a real clear lineage in the development of the P-47 based on these three designs. The P-35, the P-43, the P-47 all share common characteristics and resemble each other. Well, the P-43 went into production shortly after World War II began, and it served as an export fighter. It wasn't something that the U.S. Army Air Force could use. So Republic sent it overseas to the Chinese, where it did not have a very distinguished service career by any means.
Designed to be a high-altitude fighter, the P-43 had a top speed of 350 miles per hour and could carry a pair of 50 caliber machine guns in the nose and 4 30 calibers in the wings. Initially delivered in September 1940, the P-43 impressed some with its high service ceiling of 38,000 feet. Nonetheless, the Lancer proved inferior to most fighters of the day, and the Army Air Corps used them only for tactical reconnaissance training in the United States.
The P-43 was a failed design. There was no way Republic could look at this as anything but a failure. And here they were in the middle of wartime America. They needed to be able to come up with a design that would be effective, not just from a cost standpoint and a contract standpoint, but also they were interested in building a war-winning aircraft. And they chose to go the evolutionary route. So they studied their design. They studied the failure. They examined the reasons why. They got back reports from operational units and decided to progress in a slightly different course. But they did extract some of the better attributes of the P-43, and they applied them to what became the P-47 program.
In 1939, the Army Air Force issued a request for a high-altitude fighter that could use the new turbo supercharger that Boeing had developed for the B-17 heavy bomber. Such an installation on a fighter would require the plane to be huge indeed, but that didn't deter Republic. After studying the Army Air Force's requirements, the company's chief designer quipped, "It'll be a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with good proportions."
Because of the Army's specifications on this new fighter, Republic chose to design the P-47 around two main features. The first was a brand new engine called the Pratt & Whitney R2800, which was an 18-cylinder radial engine. It was just monstrous, and it provided 2,000 horsepower, which was far more than most any other engine of its day. So it was a very revolutionary engine. The other thing that they needed to design around was the fact that the turbo supercharger took up a lot of space. So the reason why the fuselage for the P-47 is so deep is because of the fact that the engine was so enormous to begin with, and the ductwork and all the accoutrements for the turbo supercharger required a massive amount of space.
Dubbed the XP-47B, the new fighter possessed enormous gait. As it sat on its wide, long landing gear, it reminded some of a giant milk jug on wheels. As a result, throughout the war, pilots and ground crew rarely referred to the P-47 as anything other than the jug.
In June of 1940, this is a year and a half before the war starts, the U.S. Army Air Corps places an order for 773 P-47s with Republic. And this $56 million contract is really a rich plum for Republic to get. But it represents quite a risk on the part of the Air Corps with the slender resources that are available at the time.
Not only was it risky, but it was a leap of faith that Republic could actually deliver. At the same time, the fact that they did this a year before the prototype flew was also symptomatic of a larger problem, which was there were so few combat-capable aircraft, especially fighter designs, being conceived of and built in the United States at the time, that the Air Force had to take the risk. There really wasn't very many other options.
Republic's early test flights of the prototype revealed tremendous potential and more than justified the Army's leap of faith. Though it weighed over 5 tons, the XP-47 could reach speeds over 400 miles per hour. In fact, at altitude, it was the fastest fighter ever built for the Army Air Force up to that time. Tests also showed that the P-47 was an excellent formation aircraft.
The 47, when you pulled the power on it, that huge nose out there was like running into a haystack, suddenly equipped. It was easy to fly formation because 38, you'd come in and overrun everybody. That's the first thing that we all learned when we had inline engine. You want to slow down early and sneak up on your flight leader. But on the 47, it was a beautiful airplane for flying close, very close. We trapped our flight leader one time, 2 of us coming up the Irrawaddy River, ran into the overlapping wings. And he would go like this, but you wouldn't dare do that in an aircraft that wouldn't stop or start as quickly as a 47.
In close formation, you're leading on, 3 guys are flying on another guy. They're not taking their eyes off of him. And they're flying on him all the time. They're looking at him all the time, especially if you get into clouds. If you fly in the clouds, you've got to be in tight formation, otherwise you can run into one another. And you have a mission. We had a mission one time, I think it was a 5-hour mission. We were probably 4 hours in the clouds. and 2 flights finished the mission. The guy was leading the group and my flight. The rest of them went home, got in trouble and went home.
The first production Thunderbolts rolled off Republic's assembly lines in early 1942. That spring, the Army Air Force decided that the 56th Fighter Group would be the inaugural P-47 outfit in the service. It was a historic decision that laid the foundation for one of the greatest legacies in Air Force history. With its P-47 Thunderbolts, the 56th Fighter Group would, by war's end, become one of the highest-scoring outfits in history. With dozens of aces in its ranks, the 56th became better known as the Wolfpack. In the spring of 1942, the recently formed 56th Fighter Group that had been training with a motley collection of P-40s, P-39s, and AT-6s was given the first production batch of Thunderbolts. Known as Zemke's Wolfpack after the group's commander, Hub Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group would fly P-47s for 3 years straight while building up a combat history that has become legendary since the war.
Hub Zemke was one of those pilots who possessed a very interesting blend of talents. One of the things that he is remembered for is his uncanny marksmanship. He was a great shot. He was also a great aviator. He was a tremendous pilot, had phenomenal talent there. But what really makes him stand out and gives him kind of a uniqueness not found in other aces is the fact that he was a great leader of men as well. He could inspire and lead like few men of World War II. And because of that, and plus his other talents in the air, those combined really made him one of the great combat air leaders of World War II.
56 had most of the aces most of the time. And 56 wound up with the highest air-to-air victories of any group over in the 8th Air Force, and I think any group in the war. And they were second for total aircraft destroyed, but they were first in air-to-air combat. I was assigned to the 63rd Squadron, which was Comstock Squadron. In fact, there was 4 of us got there. It was 4 or 5, and we all finished our tours. And none of us were shot down. I bailed out once, and the other kids may have gotten wounded, but no, we all finished our tours. And that was really pretty good.
In 1942, while still training in the States, the Wolfpack received the first P-47s. The unit's pilots soon discovered the new plane could be a handful. With some dangerous characteristics, the Thunderbolt could kill unsuspecting or inexperienced pilots with frightening frequency.
If you got going real fast and you approached the speed of sound, the plane started tucking. What do you do when it tucks straight down? Of course, the minute you start feeling that, you pull the power off. And usually by the time you've changed the air a little bit, it'll start coming out and you're all right. I don't know of anyone, there were a couple cases where people did not get the power off fast enough and they went right straight into the ground.
The 56th Fighter Group suffered many accidents in the course of working up with the P-47 in 1942. The reason for these accidents are pretty varied, but basically the bottom line was this. The pilots who were flying this new airplane were used to T-6s and BT-13s, fairly benign aircraft, and the P-47 represented a new level of power and performance that they really were frankly ill-equipped to deal with. So it was a tricky plane to fly. By the time they went to Europe, they had lost over a dozen pilots in training, which represents about 10% of the group dying before they even got into combat.
The pilots had to learn that size didn't matter. The P-47 was simply huge. weighing in at over 13,500 pounds when loaded. With a wingspan of 40 feet, a length of 36 feet, and sitting 15 feet off the ground, the P-47 towered over the spindly-legged P-39s and sleek P-40s the 56th had been flying.
The P-47 was probably, what was the heaviest fighter that they built. It weighed 14,000 pounds loaded when you were going to take off on combat.
Despite its size, at high altitude, the men of the 56th discovered their new fighter could outperform every other American aircraft, Army, Air Force, or Navy of its day. Its broad wing gave it tremendous agility at heights other aircraft could hardly maneuver in effectively. Some converts were made right there. Fast and brutish looking, the P-47 was the type of plane that looked like it could get into a toe-to-toe fight, take a beating, but always come out on top. And it could dish out far deadlier punishment than any other World War II fighter. With 8 .50 caliber machine guns, the Thunderbolt's firepower was truly awesome.
I strafed trains one day and tipped a boxcar over on its side, not exploded, just tipped it over from the impact. So tremendous firepower on those 850s.
Clayton Gross, a 354th Fighter Group Mustang ace, recalls being on the receiving end of a P-47 attack when he was mistaken for an ME-109.
P-47s coming in had thought they had 2 109s, and so they, picking me off, they shot my canopy off. It was gone. My plane did a snap roll, was involuntary, and so I was still alive, so I did a spin. I went into a spin. I did a recovery and pulled out, and here came the P-47s again, and I rocked my wing frantically, and this guy pulls up alongside of me and goes, "Oh!" and takes off and leaves me there. And I didn't know how badly my plane had been hit. The radio worked, the controls worked. I came back, and the plane had almost 100 holes in it. Some entry, some leaving, but it was like a sieve.
With terrific firepower, excellent high-altitude performance, and an airframe built to withstand massive amounts of damage, the men of the 56th Fighter Group gradually grew to love their P-47 Thunderbolts. By the time the group deployed to England to join the 8th Air Force in early 1943, its pilots were some of the fiercest P-47 advocates in the Army Air Force. When the 56th Fighter Group reached England in January of 1943, its pilots were dismayed to learn that they weren't going to be the first P-47 unit into combat after all. As it turned out, the 4th Fighter Group beat them to the punch. Formed from the famous Eagle Squadron the previous year, the 4th Fighter Group converted to Thunderbolts just a few days before the 56th arrived in England. And here, the love-hate relationship that characterized a pilot's relationship with the P-47 began. The men of Don Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group had been used to light and nimble Spitfires. None of them wanted to part with their Spits, especially not for something as huge and ungainly as the Thunderbolt. As much as the 56th Fighter Group loved their P-47s, the 4th despised theirs. The first combat missions flown by P-47s took place in the spring of 1943. The 8th Air Force had several Thunderbolt groups by then, and the units began flying sweeps over France to get acquainted with air combat.
These early P-47 operations and the fighter sweeps over France were plagued by several difficulties. First of all, this was a new aircraft. It had its fair share of mechanical problems that had to be worked out. Secondly, the American pilots were simply green and inexperienced at this point in the war. And lastly, and probably most significantly, they were up against some of the best German fighter pilots at the time, and therefore some of the best in the world. And they were flying FW-190As and Messerschmitt 109Gs, some of the best fighter aircraft in the world at the time.
Then on April 15th, tax day, Uncle Sam finally received payback for all the money invested in the P-47. A squadron from the 4th Fighter Group, while on patrol over France, caught 2 FW-190s in the air and shot them both down. But those would be the only victories the Thunderbolt would have for quite some time. In its first 2 months of combat operations, the 3 P-47 groups flew 2,279 sorties, resulting in 10 German planes claimed as destroyed. In return, 18 47s had been lost, both to enemy fire and by catastrophic engine failure. And the 56th, which had been the biggest supporter of the Thunderbolt, had yet to get its first victory. Finally, on June 12, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group shot down its first plane, an FW-190. That seemed to break the group's bad luck, for on the 13th, pilots from the 56th surprised a formation of FW-190s and blasted 3 of them from the sky without a loss. From then on, the 56th went on a rampage, more than earning the nickname the Wolf Pack.
I had a 109, got a 109 I think in December. We'd chased him from altitude on down, and we were really moving going down. And so I just stayed with him, and then he went into the clouds, so I pulled back up because I knew I'd overrun him. And sure, up there he came out of the clouds, and I went back down on him again and got on him and hit him right in the right wing, and he started smoking and went on crashed into the trees. So I don't know whether I killed the pilot. I didn't see a shoot. The 190 I got, the guy bailed out. And the Hinkle 111, I don't know I don't think anybody bailed out of that. I didn't see anybody. I think we'd been escorting, and then if we had a little bit of gas, we might go down and see if we could find up a target of opportunity. And we ran across these guys, about 20 of them. We tangled with them, and we got 15. And one guy chased one guy, but he couldn't catch him. And we were on the deck, working on the deck, and I think we could outfly him on the deck. He couldn't get away from me. I could turn in and keep right with him, and so I just had him going and going, and he finally decided it was better get out than to get shot down.
Toward the end of the summer of 1943, the P-47C was gradually replaced by the D model. Initially, little distinguished the two versions.
Prior to the fall of 1943, the P-47, including the D version, had really not proven itself to be effective as an escort fighter for the 8th Air Force. And the major problem was that they had this fuel-guzzling engine, and it limited their range so that they were unable to provide cover for the bombers into the main targets inside Germany. And this problem really isn't resolved until the P-47 D-15 model arrives in England. And this model has the ability to put wing tanks underneath each of the wings. Each of those wing tanks is 108 gallons. And that gives the P-47 D-15 the extra range it needs to begin to be effective as an escort fighter for the heavy bomber force.
The Thunderbolt now had almost twice the amount of fuel of earlier versions. P-47s soon appeared over Germany, within 150 miles of Berlin, wreaking havoc wherever they went. By the spring of 1944, the Thunderbolt had come into its own as a high-altitude escort fighter. Yet just as it reached its zenith, it was eclipsed by the longer-legged P-51 Mustang. As more P-51 Mustangs flooded into England, the Thunderbolts rapidly disappeared from the 8th Air Force's inventory until only the 56th Fighter Group continued to fly them. The 56th refused to change over. They loved their 47s, especially after new wide-bladed propellers arrived that greatly enhanced the plane's climb rate and acceleration. Also, by this point, Republic started to produce a lightweight, more powerful version of the P-47 that only the 56th Fighter Group used in combat. Designated the P-47M, it was the ultimate Thunderbolt.
There's about 150 of them made, and they all came to the 56th Fighter Group, except maybe a couple generals got. Actually, it was the best propeller plane that was actually in the war. And I think it was clocked at the fast, I think about 470 or 480. I think the 351 is about 460. It was supposed to be and we were the fastest, actually it was the fastest plane that they had.
The P-47M also came with a dramatically increased range thanks to the advent of larger capacity external fuel tanks. This, the ultimate version of the Thunderbolt in Europe, was finally able to stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back.
You just cruise back and forth. If you're top cover, you just kind of weave back and forth. Or if you were maybe at the target, you'd go over the target and you just kind of weave back and forth over the target until all the bombers left, and then you'd go back. Usually you'd either have duty of taking them in, you'd pick them up at a certain point, you'd take them to a certain point, then another group would relieve you. And then, because we couldn't stay up there that long, see, the bombers fly, 8, 9, 10-hour mission, and depending how far it is. And then you'd go home, and they would take them so far, and then somebody else would pick them up and bring them home.
Even in the war's waning months, the P-47 proved to be a formidable air-to-air adversary and continued to rack up an impressive toll against the Luftwaffe's best and latest fighters.
My squadron flew one mission where I think they shot down 11 long-nosed F-190s. Eight P-47s shot down 11 long-nosed 190s, didn't lose anybody. But I was on the Riviera on R&R on that mission. So.
By war's end, the 56th Fighter Group had become the top-scoring 8th Air Force unit in air-to-air victories. While the group lost 128 P-47s in combat, its pilots shot down 674 German planes and destroyed another 300 on the ground. With almost 1,000 planes to its credit, the Wolfpack had more than proven that when used right, the P-47 could be a terror to all its foes. Throughout 1944, as its long-range escort role diminished, the 9th Air Force adopted the P-47 for a new role, ground attack. Never designed for low-altitude work, pilots weren't sure how the Thunderbolt would function down on the treetops, shooting up German targets on the ground. Though it didn't perform as well on the deck as it did at 25,000 feet, the P-47 soon more than proved its worth in its new role. In fact, by war's end, it had compiled a record so remarkable that it easily became the best American fighter bomber of the war.
Among its many contributions was as the premier American ground support machine. This was the close air support fighter par excellence in the Normandy campaign. In fact, Saving Private Ryan I thought was an excellent movie, but at the end where the tank busters arrive and save the day, they're P-51 Mustangs. It would have been, I think, more accurate and more representative of what actually happened to have those be P-47 Thunderbolts doing the ground support mission. Because the P-47 was a true ground support star, whereas the P-51, yes, it did those missions, but that wasn't its major contribution.
On the deck, the 47's ruggedness was its greatest asset. Many a Thunderbolt pilot survived a holocaust of flak and machine gun fire thanks to the sheer toughness of his plane's hide.
I was the number 4 pilot, being the youngest, or the newest, I should say, and tooling along, and suddenly the field out in front just lit up like a Christmas tree. I took something in the right wing that blew off every shell I had out there. I had not fired a round at that time, but it had to have been of incendiary nature because there wasn't any ammunition left when it was all over. It blew the gun tray lid on the 4 guns out in the right wing up about that high. And, of course, holes all over the thing. Headed for home, decided the damn thing was flying and I would stay with it. Let down then, probably about 20, 30 miles from home, put the wheels down way out. Everything worked fine, except that the stall speed was all screwed up. Landed, I don't know whether that burned the brakes out or not, I really didn't care. They class 2060 airplane anyway. We didn't have repairs for them, and with that wing the way it was, I guess I was forever thankful that the darn gear went down. But 1,800 rounds, and you could see visible flame in there from whatever hit it, set it off or set the ammunition off, and that was, be real proud, even though he didn't like the 47, having come from 38s, but it absorbed tremendous damage. As far as I was concerned, it was a testimony to the manufacturing talent of the Republic.
The Thunderbolt's powerful engine could drag aloft a dizzying array of bombs and rockets, making it amazingly versatile in the fighter-bomber role.
We had 2 500-pound bombs, and then normally we carried a fragmentation bomb on the belly, 260-pound frag bomb, which was an anti-personnel bomb.
Carried a wide variety of bombs and what have you. We carried 2 500-pound bombs. We carried napalm. We carried 1,000-pound straight GPs. We carried 1,000-pound. They were in a shell similar to a 50-gallon drum, just pure dynamite. They were concussion instruments because some of the areas that we were dive bombing in and against troops were steep enough that the concussion, the blast, would kill people. It just depended on what the particular ground support mission requested.
As the P-47's role as an escort fighter was eclipsed by the P-51, so grew its role as a ground attack weapon. 9th Air Force P-47s played a tremendously important role from D-Day through the end of the war, supporting the ground troops as they pushed forward into the Reich.
We were almost entirely there to support troops on the ground. In my case, we were in what we call 29th TAC. The 9th Air Force is organized into 3 tactical air forces, 9th, 19th, and 29th. And 9th was on the south end, 19th was in the middle, and 29th was on the north end of the U.S. forces as we were going across France and Germany. And so we supported the troops that were in 9th Army.
From their aerial perches, Thunderbolt pilots searched out any targets of opportunity.
We would go out and they'd say armed reconnaissance. And what that meant essentially was if you see anything moving, go shoot, go hit it. Because by that time in the war, the Germans, there were no civilian vehicles moving in Germany. They were all related to the military in some way. Even the horse-drawn and all that was usually carrying ammunition or food or something for the troops. And anything from a single staff car to a convoy of trucks would be a target if it was moving and we were there.
Sometimes, while strafing one target, another presented itself.
I can recall a mission where we were strafing, there were about 4 or 5 large trucks. They weren't semis, they were big vans on a truck chassis, and just going down the road in convoy, and we were strafing those, and they were coming to an intersection, a 90-degree intersection in the road, And in one corner of that was a woods. And as my flight commander was pulling off the target, he just happened to look down the woods. He said, "Hey, that woods is full of airplanes." So next time around, he made a pass on the woods, strafing. And we hadn't had a shot fired at us till then, and then the whole sky lit up. And he got 104 or 5 holes in the squadron commander's airplane in the process. Lost a cylinder off his engine, and lost his radio. I was flying his wing. He hollered at us, "Don't come in," and none of the rest of us did. So he's the only one that got hit. But he got it home with 104 holes in the airplane and one cylinder missing off the engine, and so on. And the next day they went back out and bombed the airfield itself and knocked it out.
Tanks were prime targets for the roving bands of Thunderbolt pilots. During the Battle of the Bulge, the P-47 squadrons helped blunt the German attack on those few days when the weather cleared enough to get planes aloft.
Our target ended up being a row of, I think it was 5, might have been 6 Tiger tanks that were parked in an open field with snow on the ground. So they were very visible, parked in an open field. And I think probably because of the fuel situation, the Germans had no fuel. They were out of fuel. And they had parked them there and lined them up and were using them as artillery. But those were our targets. And it's a kind of a story in my group, or in my squadron. I just saw the guy yesterday. Dropped a 500-pound bomb right down the open hatch of a Tiger tank. It just happened to go right in the hatch.
During the crossing of the line, the 9th Air Force's P-47s once more played a key role in the overall operation. Thousands of Allied aircraft poured over the Reich's western frontier, suppressing flak batteries, wiping out tanks, trucks, and infantry units with ghastly effectiveness. Yet the Germans, with all their proficiency, were able to strike back with desperate intensity.
We went up there with bombs and guns and waited to be hollered at for a target, or something like that. We watched the paratroopers go in, and the Germans actually, when the paratroopers went across, I don't know how high they were, but I would guess 5,000 or 6,000 feet. The Germans actually lowered the 88s, the anti-aircraft 88s, and fired so that the shells broke amongst the parachutes. After the guys were out of the airplane, their chutes were open. And it was pretty bad. I mean, you could just see that. And the gliders came in, they were getting hit too. But, and while we were doing that, waiting for a target to be called, we had a squadron of British Lancasters come overhead and open our bomb bay doors and start dropping bombs just almost through our formation. There was a lot going on. It wasn't all coordinated as well as it could have been. Nobody got hit or hurt, so we were okay.
By war's end, Thunderbolt units had destroyed more targets than any other British or American fighter bomber. Tens of thousands of trucks, hundreds of tanks, thousands of aircraft, troops, and tons of supplies went up in flames as a result of marauding P-47 attacks. No other aircraft packed as devastating a punch, and nothing in the air could take the amount of ground fire and get its pilot home as could the beloved P-47 Thunderbolt. When the world celebrated VE Day, the JUG pilots in the 8th, 12th, 15th, and 9th Air Forces could look back with pride on their accomplishments, knowing that they played a significant role in defeating the Nazi war machine. While the P-47 played an integral role in the war in Europe, Thunderbolts had less success in the Pacific theater until very late in the war. The major thing that stymied the 47's operational use against the Japanese was its massive fuel consumption.
What really shook us up when we were getting P-47s in New Guinea was the way that thing consumed gasoline. Fuel consumption was enormous, compared to a P-40.
The P-47 represented a lot of challenges to the guys in the 5th Air Force, one of which was the fact that it consumed fuel at such a rapid rate. But when the 348th Fighter Group arrived in the Southwest Pacific, its commanding officer, Neil Kirby, became one of the advocates for the Thunderbolt. And he went all over to different fighter units in the 5th Air Force to try to convince, he was almost evangelical about it, to try to convince the other fighter leaders that this was a terrific aircraft type. He was met by stiff resistance, but eventually there were several Thunderbolt groups that were deployed into the Southwest Pacific, and they gradually figured out ways to work around the fuel consumption issues.
Half a world away, Claire Chennault's 14th Air Force in China was offered the P-47. Chennault, with his crippling fuel shortage, was not impressed.
They took the 47, they ferried them across to China. And when Chennault found out the kind of fuel consumption the 47 had, he kicked them out of there in one big hurry. Just couldn't afford that kind of a drain on his limited fuel supplies.
Though the P-47 never saw widespread use in China, it turned out to be an excellent fighter bomber for Burma. Here, as in other theaters, the 47's legendary ruggedness saved many lives. Meanwhile, as the front moved closer to Japan in the Central Pacific, the P-47 squadrons of the 7th Air Force were in the vanguard of the advance. When the Marines and Army landed in the Marianas Islands in June of 1944, the P-47s of the 318th Fighter Group were operating from the island within just a few days after the invasion of Saipan. Getting to Saipan, however, proved to be a great challenge. Unable to ferry them in from any forward Central Pacific air bases, the 7th Air Force resorted to putting the 318th's P-47s on escort carriers. The baby flat tops sailed to the Marianas, laden with the ungainly Thunderbolts. Once off of Saipan, the men of the 318th climbed into their P-47s and catapulted off the narrow carrier decks. Miraculously, not a single P-47 was lost during the operation, and the 318th was soon operating in support of the ground troops from Isley Field on Saipan. It was the only time in history where Thunderbolts were launched from aircraft carriers, and it had been a rousing success. At war's end, the 7th, 13th, and 5th Air Force's P-47 groups were being marshaled around Ishima and Okinawa in preparation for the invasion of Japan. Flying ground attack, combat air patrol, and long-range escort missions right up to the Japanese surrender, the Pacific Thunderbolts gave a solid, if unspectacular, account of themselves. In one of the last great Thunderbolt fights, the 318th Fighter Group managed to shoot down 34 kamikazes off Okinawa in a running 4-hour battle.
The last major production variant of the P-47 was the N model, and about 1,800 were built, and Republic Aviation had designed them specifically to overcome the vast distances involved in the Pacific War. The P-47N had a much greater internal fuel capacity, and they were capable of escorting B-29s all the way to Japan and back from bases on Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
When Japan finally surrendered in August of 1945, the Thunderbolt had become the most heavily produced American fighter of its generation, with over 15,000 being produced. As an escort aircraft and ground attack weapon, the P-47 formed the backbone of the Army Air Force's fighter commands through the tough middle years of World War II. In the post-war years, the P-47 quickly disappeared. By the early 1950s, the once omnipresent P-47 had become as scarce as the dodo bird. As the war faded into memory, the Thunderbolt and its accomplishments were steadily obscured by the P-51 Mustang. For 55 years, the P-47 has lived in the P-51's shadow. In reality, no other fighter contributed more to victory than the Thunderbolt. It did the dirty work, the trying ground attack and close air support missions that held no glory, but saved the lives of countless GIs. In the process, the P-47 Thunderbolt played a key role in the defeat of the Wehrmacht on the Western Front. At the same time, the P-47 helped crush the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground, setting the stage for total Allied air superiority by D-Day. A workhorse, loved by some, despised by others, the P-47 ranks as one of the greatest aerial weapons of World War II.